Good day, class. This video is about the beginning of the Civil War. Now, last week we talked about Abraham Lincoln. Now, this week we're going to talk about the very beginning of the Civil War. Now, just like last week, if you do not have the worksheet, that's fine. You can use a blank sheet of paper to take down the notes and answer the warm-up question, the middle question, and the last question. So without further ado, let's begin. So now here's your warm-up. So this question has two parts. First off, analyze the picture. What do you see in it? Make a list of whatever you see in there, however many objects. The second part is, what is happening in this picture in your opinion? Now, the only way you can truly be wrong is if you don't answer it, you copy off somebody else, or if your answer makes no sense whatsoever. Okay, let's start the notes. Now, before we start the Civil War, there are some things that we have to go back on and learn about because it's very important into the beginning of the Civil War. Now, the first person we're going to talk about is John Brown. John Brown was an abolitionist. He felt that revolting, that violence is the only way to get rid of slavery now, because he felt that diplomacy, talking about it, compromising, was now just useless. We tried it and it didn't work. Now his plan was quite simple. It was to create a rebellion against slave owners, basically causing a riot. And by causing a riot, these slave owners would lose control of their slaves. Now on October 16th, 1859, at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, his plan was to go into that area and go to the National Armory. Now in the armory, they had weapons. And his plan was to take those weapons and give them to slaves. Now he had a small group of people. There were 5 free black men and 13 white men. Now before they can gather all the weapons and distribute them, they were surrounded by the U.S. Marines, and these Marines were led by a man named Robert E. Lee. Now it's important you remember his name because you will hear it quite a bit throughout this section. The thing was, Brown was surrounded and he was outnumbered by a large number. And so he surrendered. And later he was sentenced to death. Now, after he died, he was basically considered a martyr. A martyr is a person who sacrificed themselves for a cause. Now, one man in particular named Frederick Douglass, we talked about him last semester. He was actually invited by John Brown to join them, but Frederick Douglass refused. Now, after John Brown's death, Frederick Douglass was one of the very few people who basically said, I should have been there. And he understood what John Brown was trying to do. In the North, the people saw John Brown as a man who tried to do something and it failed. Now to the South, these people were enraged. They were upset. And they felt that the Northerners, not some, all Northerners were trying to give slaves weapons and encourage them to rebel. They went as far as blaming the Republican Party as to giving the idea to these people. But again, not all Northerners agreed with John Brown. There were some, but not all. But to the Southerner people, they didn't care. Now in April 1860, there was a Democratic convention, an area where all the Democrats in the country went to. Now, the Southern Democrats, they basically walked out of the convention because somebody in the North, a Northern Democrat, basically said that there should be a slave code. Now, slave code doesn't get rid of slavery, it just, in a sense, um, puts a little kink into that process. It doesn't stop it immediately. It doesn't do anything to really harm it. It just slows it down a tad bit, and that alone ticked off the Southern Democrats, and they walked out. Now, a little known fact about Lincoln's beard is that he was actually persuaded to grow it by an 11-year-old girl named Grace Bedell. Now, this little young lady sent him a letter saying that he looked too skinny, too thin, and that she suggested growing a beard might make his face look more full. So Lincoln started growing the beard. And that's why, from when he's president on, he has that beard. Now, if you look at the list of presidents, for the most part, there's every president up until Woodrow Wilson has a mustache, a goatee, or a beard, all because of Abe Lincoln. Now, when Lincoln is elected, there's some states who've already said, hey, we're going to leave. On December 17th, 1860, there's actually a convention where these states are talking about leaving. And on December 20th, South Carolina becomes the first state to secede from the Union. They are the first state to break off from the United States. Now, a month later, in January 1861, 6 more states decide to leave: Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. Now, the thing is, Lincoln is about to be assassinated. Even before he's president, there's a growing concern that he might get assassinated, and it's now known as the Baltimore Plot. Now, the plot was this: they were going to ambush him and stab him when he stopped off in Baltimore, because he was on a train going from Springfield, Illinois to Washington, D.C. And he would stop off at different places to meet the people, say hello, things like that. But there were some people who really didn't like him as president. They didn't like how his policies about freeing the slaves. So they basically wanted to get together in Baltimore and kill him. Now, there was a very, very good agency called the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. These guys were top dogs. They were like the Secret Service times FBI and CIA. These guys were good. Now, they took the threat very seriously. And they basically told Lincoln, you can't go to Baltimore. Now, Lincoln, he really didn't care. He wanted to go to Baltimore, but the threat was truly serious. Now, here's a little fun part. February 23rd, 1861, the train arrives in Baltimore. A large amount of people are there to see Lincoln, and Lincoln's not on that train. Lincoln was actually switched on a different train, and he actually went through Baltimore earlier in the day, but no one knew. And it foiled the assassination plot. And Lincoln makes it to Washington, D.C. And on March 4th, 1861, Lincoln is inaugurated as the 16th President of the United States. Now your midpoint question. It says, do you believe John Brown should be considered a martyr? Why or why not? Again, this is an opinionated piece, so the only way you can be wrong is if you don't answer, you copy off somebody else, or if your answer is way left field. Okay, you should really start it off with I believe that John Brown, and then put should or shouldn't be considered a martyr because, and justify your answer. Okay, so to some people, Fort Sumter is the beginning of the Civil War. Now, Fort Sumter is located on an island in Charleston Harbor in South Carolina. Now, when the Confederates, the people, the rebellious people who seceded from the United States, when they seceded, they wanted all the U.S. property that was in their state, including military property. So forts, armories, things like that, they felt that belonged to them. Now, the tricky part is Lincoln didn't want to provoke an armed conflict. He didn't want to start a fight, but he knew he couldn't surrender Fort Sumter to the Confederates. Now, instead of fighting them, ordering them to fire back and things like that, he basically knew these guys are running out of food, uh, whatever type of items they needed, they're running low. So he tried to resupply them. But the Confederates basically bombed away the ships. They didn't sink them, they just scared them off, basically showed them, you cannot come in here. We control this whole area. While that was going on, there was negotiations between the Confederate general and the Union major, Robert Anderson. Now, they discussed things, but they could not come to an agreement. And on April 12th, 1861, the Confederates started shooting their guns at Fort Sumter. Now, again, to some, this is the official beginning of the Civil War. To some, it is not. And we'll get to that in a little bit. Now, on April 13th, at about 2:30 in the afternoon, Fort Sumter is officially surrendered, and the evacuation starts the next day. The thing with Fort Sumter is that nobody died. Nobody got hurt.